Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Professor Cheryl Saunders, Laureate of the 2022 Tom Prize in Rule of Law, and our host, Professor Jing-Rong Ye. Good afternoon, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to join us at the Laureate Lecture of the 2022 Tom Prize in Rule of Law. I'm Angela Liu, your MC for today's event. To begin with, we would like to invite to the stage the host of this lecture, Professor Jing-Rong Ye, Chair Professor of National Taiwan University, to give us the introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Ye.
It is our greatest pleasure to have Professor Cheryl Saunders, the 2022 Tom Prize Laureate in Rule of Law, with us today. Actually, we announced the laureate last year, but we waited for this lecture for so long. Now we have the chance to listen to Cheryl Saunders. He's going to talk to us about her experience and theorizing about constitutional landscape in the region and beyond. Currently, a laureate professor emeritus at University of Melbourne. Professor Saunders is also an elected fellow of Academy of Social Sciences in Australia and Britain Academy. She has been made an Officer of Order of the Australia, awarded the Australia Centenary Medal and Legion of Honor of France. Professor Saunders' contribution to the rule of law started at Melbourne Law School. She actually was the first female professor at Melbourne Law School. Her consistent effort in advancing research and promoting awareness are not only reflected in her rich publications, but also reflecting institutions and network she has established and engaged in. We're speaking about institution and networking, and I want to mention that Professor Saunders was also the first female president of the International Association of Constitutional Law. That term witnessed her strong leadership and remarkable influence, testified by many who were involved in the constitutional change across the region, including myself. Also through her participation in the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, that is the International IDEA. She has actively provided constitutional building assistance to those who were facing the daunting challenge of constitutional reform. One important feature of Professor Saunders' work is inclusive approach she has adopted. She always believed that in order to see and analyze constitutional building, we need to look beyond the region and the country that we are in. We need to look the other country, the other region for inspiration, and particularly when we look into the rich contextual dynamics, we'll be able to know the real issue and priorities that we human beings are facing up. Her commitment to this discipline is so strong that she traveled to many places in many regions and directly engaged in the constitutional engineering projects and related discussion. Among the region, Professor Saunders has worked on the Asia Pacific is the region that she focuses on and has been given tremendous attention to. The Asia Pacific, as we know, is unique by its diversity. Asia, with its vast population, very complicated ethnic composition, variation in historical context, rich culture, well, anything you name it. These are very, very complex. Once we look into Asia, we need to understand and a deep heart feeling that we want to understand. Not simply window dressing, or simply just mention an exotic phenomena or symbols. So Professor Saunders' work has reflected a comprehensive grasp of contextual dynamics when examining the commonalities and differences of the constitutional arrangement in the region. She normally works closely with experts and scholars and really deep dive into the local context to identify key issues and priorities that people are facing up to. It therefore becomes a remarkable feature of her work that they reflect sufficient national ownership and at the same time, strong adherence with local contexts. Professor Saunders' work are macro and micro at the same time. They are macro in the sense that they encompasses comparative study of constitution across region, illustrating the development of the global constitutional experiences. Her work also micro, in the sense that they dedicatedly reflect a comprehensive understanding of the local needs in each constitutional building project. Professor Saunders' scholarship further laid down a solid foundation to bridge the dialogue between local values and universal perspective, as we all understand the divide between universalism and particularism when it comes to constitutional engineering in various regions. The dialogue between norms at multiple levels is crucial in the era of globalization. This further led to the phenomenon of internalization of constitution and constitutionalization of international law that goes at the same time. In either direction, in either directions, clashes and tension emerge between different sets of normative values and eventually affect the path of convergence. Well, this loop never ends, and the Constitution will continue to grow and evolve under the complicated background. Professor Saunders' lecture of today, with the title, The Grand Puzzle of Comparative Constitutional Law, will lead us to explore the grand picture of comparative studies and the global constitutional dynamic the world is facing up right now. Let's welcome Professor Saunders.
Thank you very much to Professor Ye, and let's now invite Professor Saunders to deliver her speech.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Ye, for that A very generous and fulsome introduction. Distinguished guests and colleagues, I'll use this lecture today to explore three interrelated but potentially consistent themes that presently characterise the field of comparative constitutional law in which I work and for which I'm very honoured by the award of the Tang Prize in the Rule of Law. 14 years ago, also in Taiwan, I gave a speech in which I argued that comparative constitutional law needed to evolve to take account of the constitutions of the world on a global scale to recognise the potential of what I described as the constitutional gene pool. That was and is a considerable task, given the number of states and self-governing polities, around 200, and uncertainty about the relevance of growing global interdependence. And it becomes more complex still if you accept, as I do, that comparative constitutional law concerns more than just text or even interpretations of text. It extends also to factors that affect the way in which constitutions work in practice and to myriad, often unspoken assumptions that infuse them. And these include the stories that we tell ourselves about why a constitution is binding and why we should follow it, a form of constitutional imaginary. And those of you who attended Dr. Rawson's lecture this morning will see there's a certain synergy emerging already. 14 years later, there's been considerable movement towards a more global comparative constitutional law. The field is rich and absorbing and inexhaustible, adding to its appeal. But it's also unsettled in ways that are at least partly attributable to the continuing transition towards a more inclusive global approach. The three themes for my lecture are chosen to illustrate how and why this is so, and much more tentatively, the directions in which solutions might lie. The first theme is the apparent convergence of the constitutions of the states of the world, or at least of those that aspire to a form of liberal social constitutional democracy around a broadly familiar global template. Key features of that template derived historically from Western constitutional experience. They've been around long enough to justify the label of traditional, a term that I'll use from now on. By the third decade of the 21st century, the phenomenon of convergence has become intertwined with another, which also has roots of its own, which views national constitutions as part of the international legal and political order. So I'll characterise this first theme as convergence and internationalisation. I'll suggest that it has internal inconsistencies as well as being hard to reconcile with the two themes that follow. The second theme concerns constitutional arrangements in what, for convenience, I will term the Global South, while noting that the term itself is controversial. Common characteristics of states in this category include that they were colonised, de jure or de facto, offer contexts for constitutional governance that are very different from those in which the traditional template developed, and may experience quite different constitutional outcomes, whether in consequence or not. For a period, it was suggested that such states are, in Francis Fukuyama's terms, in the process of getting to Denmark. More recently, however, the tenor of this debate has begun to shift. A new emerging paradigm accepts that the constitutional arrangements of states in the Global South are, and always may be, distinctive in some respects, and that they make significant contributions in their own right to the constitutional gene pool of the world. The third theme returns the focus to states to which the features of the traditional constitutional template can be traced. For convenience, but even more loosely, I will assign these to a global north. Two quite different developments merit attention. One, which is part of the more widespread phenomenon of democratic decay, sees constitutional systems that once were, at least arguably, global role models declining in terms of both performance and reputation. The other development involves experimentation with new, more inclusive forms of democratic engagement, which might prove to be part of a democratic resurgence. Examples include greater use of direct democracy, growing interest in deliberative forums chosen by sortition or lot, and innovative ideas for the democratic application of advanced information technology. Early signs suggest, however, that these innovations are context-dependent, more readily put to use in states that are relatively affluent, cohesive and small in terms of both territory and population. Now, I've been puzzling over the relationship between these themes for some time, and I welcome the incentive offered by today's lecture to explore it more carefully. Many of the ideas that I developed today are still tentative, and I welcome the views of others on them. The title of the lecture hints at the metaphor that conveys the nature of the challenge. These themes are pieces of the grand puzzle of comparative constitutional law. They don't fit together neatly so as to give an impression of the whole. The pieces themselves are ill-formed, exacerbating the challenge. Insofar as there are solutions, they may be different in different parts of the world. The diverse Asia-Pacific region in which this lecture takes place presents a distinctive challenge of its own. Before moving to examine the themes in greater detail, let me explain why any of this matters by sketching the scope and potential uses of comparative constitutional law. I understand the field broadly to involve any insights that can be drawn from comparing two or more constitutional systems for any purpose. I include, perhaps controversially, the implicit comparison that we all draw with our own constitutional arrangements when attempting to understand others. I'm referring to constitutional systems deliberately to make it clear that I'm concerned not only with the written and formal constitution, but with the supporting framework of law, practice, context, and belief that determine how a constitution works. And for the purposes of this lecture, I'm concerned only with national constitutions linked to states or state-type polities. I exclude constitutional arrangements below the level of the state, although these also exist and may be important. Understood in this way, comparative constitutional law is a fascinating intellectual exercise. It offers the raw material from which theoretical insights can be drawn. Much comparative constitutional literature falls into this category. But I want to focus today on four more immediately practical purposes to which comparative constitutional law can be put. Most obviously, it's a necessary tool for understanding each other, whether as neighbouring states, as trading partners, or for some other reason. It's a principal source of ideas for innovation and change. Change occurs in every constitutional system, but it's urgent in transitions from authoritarianism or in post-conflict settlements for which comparative understanding can be formative if properly used. Comparative constitutional law also offers insights into the constitutional conditions of our own polities, their strengths and weaknesses, their assumptions and prejudices. And it provides the necessary foundation for the effective evolution of international law, whether through treaty, custom, or the incremental creep that accompanies the activities of many international bodies. Each of those four purposes has a critical role to play in the future of our highly complex, deeply interdependent world, rife with latent and actual conflict within and between states, and facing the urgent need for collective action to tackle existential threats, including climate change. Comparative constitutional law offers only one set of tools for this purpose, but they're significant. How significant depends on how well they're deployed. The insights gained and the conclusions drawn from any comparative project need to be robust. And this, in turn, takes us to the first piece of the grand puzzle of comparative constitutional law. Now, there are similarities and differences between all constitutional systems. Comparativists differ in the extent to which they emphasise similarity or focus on difference. Similarity is linked to the assumption of universalism, which underpinned the traditional understanding of comparative law as working towards the harmonisation of law around a common standard. Universalism, in turn, was encouraged by Enlightenment theories, imbued with expectations of where such standards would be found. In the complex constitutional world of the 21st century, other more fine-grained comparative approaches also are in play. But universalism remains influential, and globalisation reinforces the potential for convergence that it implies. The forces for convergence in the current phase of globalisation are familiar. Extraordinary advances in information technology provide instant access to information about the constitutions of the world. Intense transnational human action for a whole range of purposes provide both the opportunity and the incentive to draw on this knowledge in reshaping constitutional systems when the occasion to do so arises. And such occasions arise often. More than 2/3 of the states of the world have made new constitutions over the past 30 years or significantly altered old ones. Less dramatically, but no less significantly, global constitutional knowledge also influences the evolution of constitutions in other ways through judicial interpretation or political innovation. Now, these forces have influenced scholarship in ways that both build on convergence and contribute further to it. A new genre of comparative constitutional study has emerged, relying on quantitative analysis of the texts of large numbers of constitutions, drawing conclusions from it that offer new generalised insights and assume significant similarity. New theories that purport to have global application circulate readily on issues ranging from constitutional identity to the interpretive methods of constitutional courts. All of this has hastened a process of global constitutional convergence that in fact has been underway since at least the age of empire building and colonisation, and of course we can look further back. So as a result, at one level at least, much of the world now shares a concept of a constitution as a written instrument that organises all public power and draws its authority from the people in a centralised state. An instrument that chooses from a similar set of options for the ways in which public power is organised, that legitimises lawmaking through electoral democracy, that provides for independent judicial review, and that assumes the constitutional relevance of a shared catalogue of human rights standards. And constitutional comparison is easier to this extent. So much for the case for convergence. Now for the qualifications. The indicators of convergence that I've touched on so far are deceptive. The real stuff of constitutional law and practice lies below those generalities. The operation and outcomes of constitutional systems ultimately are what matter to the people affected by them. And these depend on a host of factors that are less tangible and less accessible than the constitutional text and institutional design, even when these are identical, which almost never is the case. Some factors are linked to the Constitution itself: interpretation, supporting laws, legal system, constitutional theory, constitutional culture. And others concern the context in which the Constitution operates and in which it must work, including geographic and population size, social and economic development, homogeneity or otherwise, and priorities for state action. Many of these factors and their impact on constitutional arrangements are challenging to grasp for comparative purposes. We can learn some things by drawing on textual similarities. Often, however, and perhaps usually, this is not enough for the implied purposes that I outlined earlier. A topical, if perhaps oversimplified example makes the point. A global survey can tell us, and it does, that there's been a rapid increase in the number of constitutions of the world that mention the environment. This is good news as far as it goes. It provides evidence of some convergence of constitutional text and perhaps also of priorities and values. But how good the news is depends on other things: what the constitutional text requires, how it works, and whether it makes a difference in practice. For questions like these, more complex inquiries are needed, however difficult this may be on a global scale. Matching comparative technique to comparative purpose is one of the enduring challenges of the field. Now, superimposed on this already complex picture, and with distinctive characteristics of its own, is the companion idea of internationalisation. And I use this as a compendious term for the expansion of the reach of international law and the deepening of its techniques for self-enforcement. There's every sign that international law will continue to develop along both these dimensions. How this occurs in practice varies between international law regimes, each of which has developed its own modalities, reflecting the phenomenon of fragmentation. Subject to this caveat, where the subject matter of international law is constitutional in character, as in relation to rights, to take only one obvious example, it contributes to the perception of constitutional convergence. And in this situation, the converging norms draw additional moral force from the legitimacy of international law. While internationalisation has implications for the constitutions of all states, it affects some states more than others in ways that parallel the de facto inequality of states in the international order. States that receive support from UN agencies in peace and/or constitution making will be under greater pressure to adopt international norms in their constitutions than others. States that are dependent on international or regional financial assistance, generally or for specific purposes, will face similar pressures of this kind. And states that lack bargaining power in international investment arrangements may be obliged to accept the constitutional norms of more powerful states. In an example of the uneven impact of internationalisation of a completely different kind, member states of transnational regional bodies will be far more constitutionally constrained by regional norms and processes than states that are not. The most advanced case of regional integration so far is the European Union. Not surprisingly, the EU has been the source of an extraordinary outpouring of comparative constitutional scholarship, prompted by the intriguing new constitutional questions that integration presents. But neither these questions nor the answers to them apply elsewhere in the world. Regional integration is underway elsewhere as well, including in Africa and Latin America. But it takes different forms in different regions, which impact differently on the constitutions of the member states. Ironically, regionalisation, which inevitably involves convergence, has added an additional source of diversity between regions, which comparative projects must take into account. And there are parts of the world that are barely regionalised at all, where this source of convergence does not apply, and the Asia-Pacific region is the principal case in point. Now, so far, this story of the spread and impact of internationalisation is simply part of the larger story of constitutional convergence in our time, the depth of which is undetermined and which has patchy operation. But over the last decade or so, internationalisation has been reinforced by another strand of thought, sometimes termed global constitutionalism. The central tenet of global constitutionalism is that the international order itself is developing constitutional characteristics. Proponents point, for example, to a conception of the rule of law at the international level, to institutions that seem broadly to exercise legislative, executive and judicial functions, and to nascent mechanisms for accountability. It's not necessary for present purposes to pursue the extent to which this perception of global constitutionalism is a reality. On any view, it's a long way from the kind of constitutionalism that operates in mature constitutional democracies. Some aspects of state-based constitutionalism, including democracy itself, are unlikely ever to be achieved at the international level. My interest rather is in the implications of global constitutionalism for national constitutions and comparative constitutional law. On at least some accounts, global constitutionalism treats national constitutions as satellites of a global constitutional order. Again, on this account, national constitutions become a catalyst for global constitutionalism in at least two ways. First, an assumption of the convergence of national constitutions encourages the view that they can be readily subsumed beneath an overarching international constitutional umbrella. And an assumption of a different kind, that democratic responsibility at the state level has been hollowed out by globalisation, is used to justify both the constitutionalisation of the international order and the progressive transfer of power to it. Exactly what this means for national constitutions is not developed by these theories, which typically emanate from international or supranational legal scholarship. Nevertheless, they imply both a rationale and a procedure for the continuing convergence of national constitutions. They encourage and add legitimacy to the already extensive practice of external support to national constitution building projects. And potentially, they change the very concept of a constitution as a fundamental law for a state that depends for its form, operation, and legitimacy on the state and its people, to one that draws its authority from international law. Theories of global constitutionalism, in fact, have very little purchase in constitutional or comparative constitutional law, but they draw enough encouragement from the evolution of the international order to suggest that they can't be dismissed out of hand. And I offer 4 examples. The claim that states have lost a degree of constitutional autonomy has some synergy with the erosion of de facto state sovereignty that undoubtedly has occurred. It never took the extreme forms initially predicted, and it's likely never to do so as long as states remain the basic building block of the world order. But further changes of some kind in the role and function of states may occur. Secondly, with the benefit of hindsight, since the current set of international institutions was established in the wake of the Second World War, they have played a role in bringing states into being through decolonisation and other processes. The pace has slowed, but it continues, as quite different examples of Timor-Leste, South Sudan and Bougainville show. Statehood has never formally required international approval of the state's constitution, but the need for international recognition has the potential to act as proxy for it. Thirdly, there are in any event famous cases in which international forces have largely, if not entirely, crafted a constitution for a state. Germany and Japan in the wake of the Second World War are examples. These instances are rare, but provide a foundation for a claim that constitution making is an accepted technique of international law, and that's a quote. And finally, as Chai-Hak Ham and Sang-Ho Kim have persuasively argued, there's an interface of some kind with the outside world in the making of every constitution. Now, what these and similar examples suggest to me is that constitutional law, including comparative constitutional law, needs to pay much greater attention to the exercise of external sovereignty by states. This is now, after all, a significant dimension of governmental decision-making. Greater accountability and transparency arguably is needed for decisions of state institutions with responsibility for their peoples, but operating in an interdependent world. As matters presently stand, however, answers to questions about the ambiguous relationship between state constitutions and external forces don't seem to me to lie in the direction suggested by global constitutionalism. The subordination of state constitutions to a global legal order is inconsistent with constitutional theory and practical realities, and it also seems normatively undesirable, stripping state constitutions of the properties on which their effectiveness relies without a persuasive alternative. So to substantiate these points, All the theories on which the legitimacy and effect of constitutions depend are state-centred. The most familiar of these is popular sovereignty, but the same is true of other variants. There are no signs that states anywhere accept that their constitutional autonomy is formally limited by the international order in the ways in which global constitutionalism claims. If anything, there's been state pushback against de facto international inroads on constitutional autonomy in recent years. This is so even in conditions of regional integration, where theories of global constitutionalism have most purchase. Brexit and the emergence of theories of constitutional identity are only two of the European examples that might be given. The effective operation of constitutional government necessarily depends on state institutions, state leaders, and their peoples. This is true even in states where there's been extensive international involvement during the constitution-making phase. Even during this phase, all international institutions now pay at least lip service to local ownership. And once a constitution is in place, local institutions are largely on their own to make it work or to deal with its failure to do so, as the case may be. Of course, one problem with the status quo is that too many states do not serve their populations. The state itself may be weak, state institutions may have been captured by other interests, authoritarian ideologies may subordinate the public interest to other goals, and we could go on. But whatever the solution to these often wicked problems, history suggests that international pressure also has its limitations. So let me summarise the position reached at the end of this long account of the first of the themes. There has been considerable formal convergence of constitutional arrangements around the concepts and institutions that spread from the historical experience of Western states. On the other hand, the convergence lacks depth and typically is not reflected in matters of significant detail. These developments in comparative constitutional law are paralleled by strands of thought and practice in international law about the role of constitutions in the global order. And these ideas build on and further encourage assumptions of convergence around the traditional template. They have a degree of plausibility that derives from relations between states in the international order, but they also are inconsistent with the theories from which constitutions draw their status and effect, and with the ways in which constitutions work in practice. Now, I'll return to these issues towards the end of the lecture, but let me turn now to the second theme in which internationalisation appears in a different guise. This theme engages with the constitutional experiences of what is now widely called the Global South, taking over from earlier equally unsatisfactory terms such as the Third World or the Developing World. The ambit of the Global South for constitutional purposes is vague, but to generalise, it covers Africa, much of Asia and Oceania, the Middle East, and at least parts of Latin America. Self-evidently, despite the label, the Global South is not homogeneous. Consider, for example, the multiple differences with constitutional significance between Kenya, Sri Lanka, Thailand, and Fiji. States in the Global South share one or more of the following features. They once were colonised and are still dealing with the consequences. They have adapted the institutional forms of the traditional constitutional template to their own distinctive historical and contemporary conditions. And they lack global economic and political clout, making them vulnerable to international pressures with constitutional effects. Until recently, there was a tendency in comparative constitutional law to focus comparative analysis around the legal experiences of a small number of states deemed to be leaders in the field, from which the so-called constitutional canon was drawn. At the core of this group is and was the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and Germany, the progenitors of so many of the ideas and institutions that dominate global constitutional discourse and practice. But these states hardly reflect the constitutional experiences of the bulk of the world. As constitutional comparison on a global scale became both more pressing and more feasible, there was mounting criticism of the limited ambition of the discipline. As a result, the range of comparative cases widened to include, for example, South Africa, India, and Colombia. Comparative scholars from other countries entered the field, and studies of constitutional phenomena on a more global scale began to take place, with constitutional courts a frequent focus. Initially, however, much of this work continued to rely on the traditional constitutional template as the benchmark for analysis. The more recent emergence of the Global South as a theme in comparative constitutional law is different in kind. To paraphrase one recent and influential contribution to the field, it demands comparative scholarship from the perspective of the Global South, not only for the consumption of the Global South or with scholars from the Global South. In other words, it treats the constitutional experiences of states in the Global South as objects of comparative interest in their own right. One rationale for distinguishing the Global South in this way lies in context, broadly conceived. The traditional constitutional template developed and evolved in the context of particular conditions. These included strong centralised states, a homogenous people that could be said to constitute a demos, and historical experiences that contribute to a constitutional culture that supported the template in form and operation. But the contexts in which constitutions operate in much of the Global South inevitably differ in ways that may impact on the constitutional choices that are made. Some differences are conceptual, including, for example, lessons drawn from history, attitudes to law, the impacts of religion or culture, and some are practical, shaped by the factors I mentioned earlier, such as population and geographic size and economic conditions. Accommodating the constitutional arrangements of the Global South in context affects comparative constitutional law in one or all of three ways. On any view, it requires attention to be paid to the form and operation of constitutional systems in the Global South as an integral part of global constitutional experience. Secondly, constitutional arrangements that seem likely to be enduring rather than transitional need inclusion and analysis on that basis. And the third point follows. The constitutional experiences of the Global South need to be accepted as potentially a source of new ideas that are not necessarily context-dependent, which may have application, useful application elsewhere in the world. With hindsight, this process is already taking place. Examples include, for example, the recent absorption into global constitutional discourse of ideas about implied limits on constitutional amendments, judicial review of social and economic rights, and so on. I suggested earlier that the first theme I explored in this lecture of convergence and internationalisation is unstable for reasons related to its internal contradictions. This theme is unstable too, but for different reasons. Emphasis on the Global South as a contributor to global constitutional experience and not merely a recipient of it is relatively new. It brings methodologies into play that are underdeveloped. One is the need to better understand the role and nature of culture in comparative constitutional law. And the theme is unstable also because even if it becomes established in the terms in which I described it, there are still open questions about where key parameters will be set. And setting the parameters are important because there are risks to be avoided. The risks lie in the potential for abuse of this approach to the constitutional systems of the Global South. The idea that states have particular histories, contexts, and cultures that affect their constitutional arrangements is patently correct, but it's susceptible to manipulation by cynical leaders or other forces seeking to consolidate their own power. The Asian values debate of the 1990s offered an example, and the risks have magnified since on a global scale, with the emergence of negative forms of nationalism, further fuelled by populism, and leading to claims about constitutional identity that favour authoritarianism. Steering around these shoals it will be no easy task. And it also needs to avoid the neo-colonialism of two sets of assumptions. One is that the human values that traditional constitutionalism seeks to promote are not suited to the global south. That's the Asian values discourse. And the other is that the traditional constitutional template is the only form through which those values can be achieved. At least one of these traps can be avoided readily enough. The whole purpose of the southern turn in comparative constitutional law is to draw on the constitutional experiences of the global south in the 21st century. It's not a license to return to an often mythical, glorious past. On the contrary, the constitutional experience of every state in the 21st century is the product of everything that's gone before. This may include enduring influences from systems of government stretching back over centuries, but it also includes colonialism and decolonisation and their aftermath, together with the population movements involved. And it includes the global spread of aspirations to capture the benefits associated with the traditional constitutional template, including popular government, security and stability, human dignity and freedom, and a rule of law. This broad guidance aside, debate is only just beginning about where and by whom the parameters should be drawn so as to accommodate constitutional realities in the global south. But the potential gains for the practical applications of comparative constitutional law are tantalising. In particular, it's possible, although by no means certain, that a more contextual and less prescriptive focus on constitutional challenges in the global south would lead to outcomes that work better for their peoples. My third theme, which I will deal with much more speedily, returns to states with established and apparently stable constitutional arrangements. In the past, these states have provided benchmarks and presented as role models for others seeking the benefits of constitutional democracy. And these also are the states from which, until recently, much scholarship tended to emanate. Like much of the rest of the world, the constitutional arrangements of these states have shown signs of deterioration in recent years. Even without turning to what seem obvious examples of democratic decay, constitutional systems look a bit tired. Symptoms include the following: declining membership of political parties, widespread disengagement from traditional politics, the expansion of executive authority, over-reliance on courts to protect constitutional values, putting their independence and expertise at risk, deepening polarisation within communities, sometimes driven by identity politics and sometimes by epidemics of fake news, and suspicion of state and other public institutions fueling privatisation and the dominance of private economic over public interests. These developments have negative implications for what I've been describing as the traditional constitutional template and its global currency. Most obviously, the decline in the legitimacy and performance of constitutional institutions in sections of the global north raises questions about the attraction of the model around which convergence historically has occurred. And this in turn has implications for the geopolitical competition between democratic and authoritarian constitutional systems. Constitutional competition has been a reality for some time, but now is more marked than at any time since the Cold War. There's also a potentially more positive story, however. In parallel with symptoms of constitutional deterioration are new initiatives that could play a role in democratic resurgence. Their collective effect is to include a wider and different range of citizens in active public decision-making than typically occurs in a representative democracy. And I mentioned three such initiatives in particular. One is greater recourse to the mechanisms of direct democracy through referendum or plebiscite. Another is the growing use of deliberative gatherings of diverse citizens to consider and seek consensus on contested issues. These have a variety of names, but Citizens' Assembly is common. And a third proposal, still on the drawing board, is to use technology to enable citizens to participate directly in public decision-making processes in what Helene Landemore has termed open democracy. What we may be seeing here is evolution of the traditional forms of representative democracy. Equally, however, we may not. This theme is unstable as well. Many publics are still in a developmental stage, and the use of technology in the way that Landemore has suggested is untested. All of these techniques are vulnerable in an age of polarisation fuelled by the global spread of fake news. And the relationship between each of them and the form and operation of traditional democracy is unclear. If, as seems more likely, they are used to complement representative democracy, the traditional representative institutions and processes have a lot of adapting to do. But if they seek to replace representative democracy, in part or in whole, the upheaval will be greater still and will certainly be resisted. A theoretical debate about the respective merits of election and sortition already is underway. Even if these initiatives become established, they may not have global application. Much of this experimentation is taking place in the global north, and some of it in relatively small and homogeneous states in the global north. By their nature, these particular institutions and processes seem less suited to larger states, and in particular to states that are less affluent and more divided. So for the moment, they look like offering new points of difference between states in the global north and elsewhere. So now let me conclude. We live in a time when comparative constitutional law on a global scale is a necessity and gradually becoming a reality. But the field continues to face challenges. Some stem from its earlier, more limited parameters, and some are new. In this lecture, I've packaged 3 sets of these challenges as themes or puzzle pieces that collectively contribute to a grand picture of global comparative constitutional law. Each of those 3 themes presently is developing largely in isolation from the others, and each is itself in a state of flux. On one view of possible outcomes indicated by current conditions, the themes could be reconciled through greater recognition of the relevance of constitutional context, acceptance of the reality and value of difference, and openness to the continuing evolution of constitutional arrangements. But even on that view, reconciliation may look different in different regions of the world, and these outcomes are unpredictable, at least partly dependent on factors well beyond constitutional law. Running through all these themes is a tension between transnational standards and the relevance of local ownership and difference. This is an old tension, given new life by the expansion of the international sphere. Resolution of the tension to ask who should do what, why, and how is a key issue for the future of both constitutional and international law. There presently are no definitive answers. Oddly, there isn't even much debate. There is an opportunity for progress here. At the moment, the relationship between constitutional and international law is treated by both as a zero-sum game. Constitutional lawyers assume state sovereignty, largely ignoring both the significance of the exercise of external sovereignty and the implications of the need for collective action in the global common good for the responsibilities of state actors. International lawyers, on the other hand, envisage a continued exponential growth of international law with assumed hierarchical superiority vis-à-vis state law, while ignoring the dependence of international law on effective state action within the framework of a working constitution. There's a need for productive dialogue between these 2 different and influential legal worldviews, even if, in the short term, the outcome is no more than better informed and respectful coexistence in conscious acceptance of pluralism. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to our laureate, Professor Saunders. And now we would like to invite back to the stage Professor Ye to give us the conclusion.
Thank you, Cheryl. Professor Cheryl Saunders provided us with 3 themes. Number 1 is internalization and also convergence of the constitutional law. And after that, she kind of evolved the theory into the global South and the global North. Well, these 3 themes, as we understand it today, actually cut across today, yesterday, and tomorrow. These 3 themes actually could serve as a benchmark to see the evolution of constitutionalism, starting from Magna Carta, the integration and disintegration of Europe, the independence of the United States, and also the dynamic development of Asia, South America, Africa. You know, if you look into the human civilization, it's intriguing to see the role of constitution, the role of constitutionalism at play that affect our life and that affect our destiny that we are having today. So that 3 themes serve as a tool to understand how we got from there to here. But more importantly, it serves as a very important tool to understand what we are confronting today. Not only in Taiwan, in Asia, in China, in Europe, in Africa. Let me just mention a few examples. Our neighbor, Thailand, are having trouble in picking up a premier, even after a very kind of clear election. There's some political party who, won the election, but still, because of the rules, constitutional rules that make them puzzled and even caged to find a solution. In Europe, that could, be part of the global north that Professor Saunders was talking about. In Poland, in Hungary, you have that kind of democratic backsliding concern, and also the political intervention or limitation of judicial powers in the name of judicial reform. And guess what? The same thing happened recently in Israel also. People took it to the street. For what reason? For judicial reform. They worry that liberal constitutionalism may be at stake. Lots of happenings has been going on, not only in Taiwan, in Asia, or in Europe, but actually in everywhere. How are we going to analyze this kind of dynamic development? Cheryl's 3 themes help us have a deeper understanding. But more importantly, I would argue, and as I learned from the lecture, this 3 themes has forward-looking significance as we are living in a world of uncertainties. Technologically, politically, even militarily, you name it, or morally. So what is going to happen in Asia, in Europe, after Brexit? EU is facing some problem, and notwithstanding, recent development in the way of EU directives and lots of legal establishment, but there are problems. In the United States, of course, there are problems. I heard from my American constitutional law professor that saying that over the last couple of years, he witnessed United States has never been so divided, and he never worried so much. Well, how about in Asia? Of course, we did not pinpoint a very important big force in Asia, that is China. We did not do that in the constitutional discourse. But China is there with that kind of very special kind of constitutional governance. And we, Taiwan, just so close to it. How are we going to deal with it? I mean, in the future. Normally, we will say, this is Taiwan's destiny. What will be our future of Taiwan? But it is a global issue. It's not only a regional issue. So how are we going to see this kind of development from the perspective of constitutional governance? Professor Saunders' three themes, provided us with some guidance. I'm not going to kind of making conclusion, and Professor Saunders would have her own view on it, and particularly with that powerful analytical structure, I think those of us could benefit quite a bit and continue to explore into those fronts. And I was inspired by that kind of framework and rich, analysis and kind of length and depth of that. And I think in the future, we'll have lots of issues to talk about. But it takes awareness of the government in the world, awareness of the citizens in the world, awareness of the business circle in the world to understand the importance of constitutional governance. Constitutional governance often work against short-term gain. Short-term gain by politicians, by political parties, by interest group. When it comes to constitutional building, those of us may have a view that you are making trouble. Why bother talking about this? You are bringing up instabilities, argument, debate, uncertainties. But try to consider some of the situation, which is quite phenomenal in some way, that the society is so divided. There are even intra-conflicts. Conflicts not only in the way of political competition through democratic way, but military conflicts, or in between. A society or country or region may run into that kind of divide, blocking lots of reasonable development, creating lots of danger and risk to humanity. Do we need to look into the governing structure of our society and see some improvements? Well, it's hard to say improvements. Some people may disagree about that. But should we talk about that? Should we begin to engage in some of the deliberations, sharing the views, sharing the mindset, formulating priorities for reform? And that's why I see what Professor Saunders has been working on is so critical. Let me begin by the first theme and have some adding to that, and I found this is really important. The first one, convergence and internationalization and complexity of those has been elaborated by Professor Saunders. But we need to know we are living in a multi-level governance with different set of norms. They need coordination. In any given country, you do trade with others. You have human flow. You have information flow. We are in this global village, one way or the other. So those sets of forms in different levels are going to collide with each other. Once you cannot solve that out, you are creating lots of unnecessary conflicts and barriers to human engagement. So integration and disintegration may be in the form of institution, but maybe in the form of norms. And this is very important. As we see into the dynamics, it's not a clear picture. Actually, it happened in various ways. And the global south, as we heard from Professor Saunders, he mentioned about a very typical debate that is Asian value, as if South should be treated differently. But look into the context, you'll find that even the Asian value debate is not about the governance. It's about who is talking. I mean, the national leader is talking. All the people are talking. It may be defined simply by authoritarian rulers. Does they have social support? Does they have solid cultural basis? So that brings about how we see global south. Well, the south and north dichotomy could serve some function, but it may serve counter significance. Some people may take it as a way to shield our connection or our comparison with others. It was that kind of awareness, that is global convergence, blessing of liberal constitutionalism while celebrating or honoring particularism in special context that will honor us to march forward. Global norths are also facing tremendous problems. But it is not global south celebration. It's global south suffer. Because it's so connected. So I want to echo Professor Saunders, that divide, global south and global north, actually is not a clear line separating two interests. Rather, it's a tool for us to march together and recognize that we need to talk. Let me conclude by saying something that I used to say before. While we are dealing with the debate about universalism and particularism, one way or the other, I always found that we have an excluded middle. That middle of discourse is squeezed by both sides. Some argue that everything is universal, so you need to follow the rule. Some argue that we should be different, try to maximize particularism. How about the middle ground for our discourse from global scale? And I would say Professor Saunders, to her very insightful presentation, has enriched the middle ground that I have been advocating with that. Thank you, Professor Saunders. And ladies and gentlemen, please join me, give a biggest applause to Professor Saunders for her insightful lecture.
Thank you once again
Thank you so
to
much.
our laureate, Professor Saunders, and thank you to Professor Ye. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes the laureate lecture for the rule of law. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Please don't forget your personal belongings as you leave, and we wish you a good day. 各位来宾，第5届唐奖得奖人演讲法制场到这边圆满告一个段落，非常感谢您的参与，希望大家都有满满的收获。离场的时候，请记得您随身携带的物品，并且归还您所借取的同步口译接收器，取回您的证件。祝福大家平安顺心，谢谢。